Now, as word, uh, if you do administer the MAP test, you will be able to get output like this that shows you where all your students are. Excuse me for a second, I just got to change some stuff here. It'll show you where all your students are on a variety of different components. And this is just made up data here. I'm assuming they didn't put real stuff on the internet, but maybe they did. Who knows? Uh, but the important thing is that I look at what grade people are in. I can look at test date, their RIT values, standard error, their RIT range again. This is what they actually got. This is where their ability likely is, knowing that this isn't a perfectly reliable test. We have their percentile ranks, looking at all the way down from the bottom, right? A RIT score of 141 is at the first percentile, all the way up to a RIT of 186. You have, if we're talking about reading, we can talk about lexiles as well. And lexiles are one way to measure text complexity. And text complexity comes into play when we're really talking about what students should be reading based on their ability to actually decode and process the text. And the idea being that if you give students texts to read that are too hard, they won't be interested because they won't really get what's going on. They may try to slog through something that they find really interesting, but they won't really comprehend what's going on. And you'd be amazed at studies that have looked at how we fail to recognize or realize that we aren't understanding something that we're reading. Studies that have done where people do these things called think aloud protocols, where they have to explain what's going on after they have read to comprehension through self-assessment. Uh, they can't answer questions about the text. They can read it and they have a vague understanding, but if you ask them questions that they would need to really understand it to answer, they can't do it. And it's usually because they don't know particular words. So it's broken down by subcategory here, which is great, right? You can look at where your students are. Beginning readers, right? These are, again, first graders. So they should be beginning readers. But you get up to these kids who are in the higher lexiles at the higher percentage ranges, and you have these lexile ranges. In books these days, you can usually look up any book and find out what lexile range it is at. Where this comes in handy, of course, is, for instance, my wife's school did something called Battle of the Books. And as you all know, her students are pretty low performing students in the sense of that when we look at their percentile ranks, they are all, down at the bottom. They're in fifth grade, but none of them are reading at a fifth grade level, I should say, in her class. And the people who did Battle of the Books decided that they would just pick books that they liked. Well, when my wife was looking at the books, she was realizing that these books were just way too hard for her kids to read. And the goal behind this was to instill a joy in reading, to get kids to read more on their own, to really take ownership of what was going on. But the problem was that when we looked at the Lexile scores of the books and the Lexile scores or ranges of her students, two of her students could read two of the books. Two of their students could read one of the books. One student could read two of the books, but all the rest of the students really couldn't read any of them on their own and really comprehend what was going on. So she took this information, she made a little chart and stuff, and she took it to the principal and the people who were in charge of this, but they kind of didn't listen to her. And the whole process is kind of, well, people just aren't paying attention to it. And she started going through the books with them in class to try to help them out. And her class may win this thing because nobody else seems to be reading them. But we'll see. I'll keep you posted on what happens with that. But this really gives you a good way to say, well, what is appropriate? If you have a classroom library and you look at where your students are, you can suggest books to students. I would still let them pick based on their interests. Or if you take them on field trips to the library or to bookstores to purchase books, You can make suggestions about books that they will probably find the most enjoyable and the ones that will help them develop their reading skills the most. So, incredibly good tool for this. Uh, each student also, in the software that comes with this, and this stuff ain't cheap, of course, but you get this student goal setting worksheet, and you have the student's name, right? You have their RIT scores from different areas and different time points. They look at where people are, what their growth is, what their compare that to typical growth, and then you look at what their subcomponent skills are, and you set goals. So you create an action plan for each student, either within the classroom or outside of the classroom. Now, if you have a widely uh, differentiated classroom, or I should say, if you have students in your classroom who have a wide range of abilities, well, then this means that you have to do a massive amount of differentiation. Uh, for whole group instruction, might not be that effective. But if within your own class, if you have a lot of heterogeneity or you have students who are very different from each other, you can break them down into groups. You can do the whole instruction for the basics of the idea, and then you can break people down in groups to try to make the learning time the most beneficial and to try to get them to sustain that learning outside of the classroom. And I can't say enough that that should be one of your goals all the time. Try to get people learning outside of the classroom, uh, especially the kids who are behind, because usually the kids who are ahead are learning outside the classroom already. If they're not challenged, you do want to provide that challenge for them, just as much as you want to provide the challenge for the kids who are on the low end and who aren't typically being challenged either. Again, here's a, disaffected youth who seems kind of bored with the whole process. But this is where your goal setting worksheet uh, can be used to make this plan for reading math or whatever. As far as the Lexile range goes in terms of reading, if we really want to break it down a little bit more, we look at their Lexile range, and the top part should be the reading material that you can provide support with. So if you are talking about a book in class, or you have groups working on different books, when we were kids, I remember when I was in first grade, I started out in the middle group. I think I forgot what we were called, but it was such classic uh, descriptive names. I don't think the slow group was called the Snails, uh, but they may have been, or the Turtles. And I think I started in the Chipmunks, and then I moved up into the Eagles partway through their year. And again, let's not tell the kids what group they're in, but anyone with a brain will kind of put two and two together. But anyway, so this is the area of their range that you would use instructional support with. This is the area that you want them to focus on when they are reading on their own, because they will be able to understand it. They will be able to, or I should say, it's more likely to sustain their interest. And when we're looking at Lexile charts, here is whole classroom profile. And you look at the Lexile ranges in one classroom, and they're very, very different, right? You have all these different instructional levels in which there isn't a whole heck of a lot of overlap. And you may say to yourself, well, geez, how am I going to meet the needs of all these students based on this? How is this going to modify my instruction? How is this going to modify my assessment? And we've talked in the classroom about using these kind of whole class assessments, and in some ways, sometimes they're appropriate. But if you do have the time, and I don't think you will your first year, but as things get easier, if you do have the time, break things down into subgroups. And if you look at this child, is way below grade level, may have a learning disability, not sure, could be an ELL student or something like that just needs time to master the language, but they would need some kind of extra help. You could reasonably put these 5 or these 8 kids in a group, paying special attention to these 3 or these 5, depending on whether you go with the 5 or 8 group, making sure they have a lot of support to keep up with them. This next group is relatively homogeneous, right? You could have another group of 6 or 7 here, and they would be very easy to place together. And you could break into subgroups too, that's up to you. And then you have this group of higher performers here that you could either have as leaders in other groups, but that can cause classroom conflicts and other management problems, or you could have them working on their own on different books. But it really allows you to see how your classroom is broken down and where everyone's at in terms of reading. Now, there isn't a similar thing for math, but you can think about it in the same way when you look at RIT scores for basic skills and components, that you get a profile of your entire class, and then you are able to make some decisions about where you want to target your curriculum to best meet their needs. Now, another thing that this does is it looks at the progress of the student over several years. And here we have, fall 02, spring 03, fall 03, and so on. And, you have the student, you have the district average, you have the norm group average, and so on. Math, reading, language, and so on. Here you have this classic kind of growth here, where you have an increase from fall to spring. You have some forgetting during these months. You have the increase again, forgetting over summer, increase, forgetting, increase, and then this goes to spring 07. You would have another dip again during fall, which is why a lot of people say we should have year-round school, or the summer vacation shouldn't be that long. And I've said this before. Looking at teacher report, you have all your students. Hopefully these are fictional people. 9th grade class. You have their RIT ranges, test date, test type, survey with goals, longer version, remember. You have your standard errors, also something I guess I didn't point out before, right? 199 standard error of 3.3. And if you look at that, then they are extending the RIT range about 1 standard error above and below. Standard error you can think of like I talked about standard deviation. Standard error means that if I'm estimating 199 to be this student's RIT score, the standard or typical error that I'm making is about a 3-point error. And sometimes we extend that standard error above, or 1 standard error above and below the score. Now this RIT range then is not a 95% RIT range. I'm not 95% certain that it's in there. In this case, I'm 68% certain that their range is in there, because 1 standard error above and 1 standard error below, there's 34% in each one of those. You can look at the graph in the notes of the interpreting standardized test stuff to see how that all breaks down, and we'll probably talk about that on that last Wednesday when we're doing the whole review bit. You have your percentiles and so on, percentile range, Lexa range, and then you have all this word recognition stuff for reading. So this is one way to look at the whole class, and you can rank it in this way. You can also look at hold on here, this isn't good. The district by grades, and looking at this, you have things broken down into students who have met adequate progress and students who haven't met their adequate progress, and this is the above typical growth or below typical growth. But then you also have a measure of proficiency. So you have people, the green people of course, above typical growth, at or above where they should be in terms of grade level, and then you also have above people who have grown more than is typical, but they are still below where they need to be. You have your orange people who are below typical growth, but they do meet their proficiency standards, so they haven't grown as much, I should say they are notably different from what growth is typical, but they are still proficient. And then you have the red people, of course, color coding, all the cognition that goes along with the color red, below typical growth and below projected proficiency. Looking at the percentages of your classes then, right? different grades. You have the overall score, what percentage of students are at below typical growth and below grade level, people who are above typical growth and below. So all these people combined are below grade level. These people combined are above grade level. The color tells you whether or not then their growth is where it should be or below where it should be, and so on. Looking at growth from one year, looking at projected performance, you can make some claims about how your school is doing as a whole, whether or not things are progressing as they should, and so on. Another way, get rid of this thing again. Another way that we can look at this is based on school profiles, and you look at this. Well, Grant Middle School seems to be probably one of the wealthier schools in the district, one of the better schools. You have so many kids who are growing more. They're also at or above proficiency. These people are above proficiency, and then you only have this small group of people, in this case a total of 7.1% of the people who are below grade level, which is pretty doggone amazing. Looking at Lexington, you have a lot more people. Still not the majority. In some schools you do have the majority of people below grade level, but in this case you have 33.5% below grade level. Most of which are growing less than they should. Some of which have grown more than they should. Maybe they're catching up, but you still have the majority of students who are at grade level and also growing. That's more than typical. Here you have another, Warren is similar to Grant, and then you're looking at Edwards Middle School and Edwards High School as kind of the ones that are struggling on the student profile of how things are progressing. Get rid of this dynamic reporting suite again. Here you have, a fake teacher. You have their classroom. A grade 5 profile, high growth, typical growth, low growth, looking at how things break down in terms of reading and math. You have projected performance, distributions of students by quartile, and so on. And we go on and we can graphically represent, really, at a glance, where your students are. In this case, you have most of your students planning on being proficient, which is nice, and so on. And you can look at the keys up here. Down here, when we talk about the quartiles, we have the low, the mid-low, mid-high, and high, and you see that most of the students are in that mid-high range. With the mathematics, same kind of interpretation. You can break it down by percentages. Again, this is the proficiency in this case, 10 and 90. Here you have the different percentages of these different growth levels. And in this way, you can get a gauge at a glance, if you are looking at students' last year's test scores, where they're at with basically everything. You can look at last year's reports, get very detailed information on particular students, if you want, in terms of their Lexile ranges, or math reports look like this as well. You can get even more detailed reports about the subcomponent skills and things like that. And I think I'll show you some of those things in our last class meeting or on Wednesday for those of you who have class. For the online people, I'll have another video that looks at that. Now, one thing I do want you to consider is then how you apply this information into the classroom. Finding gaps, for one thing, is looking at, well, where do we have holes in our curriculum? Where do I have holes in what I'm teaching or how I'm teaching? Where am I not meeting the needs of my students? I can look at in better detail along all these different metrics how people are progressing. I can look at whether or not my programs, if I have a tutoring or remedial program or basic curricular programs, I can look at how well those are doing, how effective they are. I can use these as talking points in conferences with parents. And ultimately, all these things come down to really informing the instructional decisions that I make. What I will want you to do, and I'll be asking a question about this, is I'll be asking a few short answer questions about the differences between map testing and traditional testing, and also how you would use map tests to meet the needs of your students, coming up with a few ways. So it's something to think about. And that's it.